Great. Hello, everyone. How's it going? Doing all right? Okay. Well, thank you for coming back for week 3. Who was here either of the previous sessions? Raise your hand. Okay, looks like most of us. Excellent. Welcome back. Okay, so our topic for today is going to be charts and tables. Okay, so we're going to be getting a little bit more into some of the summarizing functions, some more of the kind of built-in functions of Excel. We'll be focusing a little bit less on formulas than we did the last 2 weeks, but we will still be doing some formulas today. It should mostly be a review of some stuff we talked about the last 2 weeks. So it'll be a good little refresher if you were here, or a good kind of quick overview if you weren't. The data set we're going to be working with today is very similar to the data set from last week, but it is slightly different. It's at this link. We won't use it for a couple of slides. Just going to grab the door. Thank you so much. So please go ahead and grab that. This session today, like our last couple sessions, will be pretty interactive. So I'll go through a little bit, and then you'll go through the exercises kind of as we go, similar to last couple weeks. The door situation. Sorry for that. Okay. And if you didn't check your name for the attendance when you came in, if you could just do that before you leave, that'd be great. Cool. Okay, so let's get into it. All right, so our big topic for today is pivot tables. Okay, we're going to be talking about how to create, modify pivot tables. We're also going to talk about charts, so how you create a chart from data that you have in Excel. We'll talk about the different chart types, how to do that effectively. We're going to talk about static versus pivot charts. So there's a chart feature that's connected to this pivot chart, pivot table feature that we're going to talk about. We'll talk about the difference there, and then we'll talk a little bit about chart formatting as well. All right. So specifically, as I mentioned, we're going to be getting into tables and charts that are not pivot tables and charts. Then we will talk about pivot tables and charts. We're also going to talk about named ranges. And I think we also did not get to conditional formatting in week 1. So we are also going to touch on conditional formatting, which can kind of be used in conjunction with some of these things. Okay, so just a quick review. This is what we've covered in the first 2 weeks of our Excel series so far this semester. So we covered some kind of just data formatting basics. How do we kind of manipulate data in Excel, make sure it's showing up as the right format, looks clean, all of that. The first session, we talked about data validation. So this is making sure that you can set rules to make sure that your data is following certain criteria. For example, if you have a column where you want it to be a number, or you want whoever's inputting data to select from a given set of options, like a drop-down menu, that's data validation. We talked about some of our basic formulas. So these are our formulas to do kind of basic math functions, things like sum, average. We also talked about a bunch of formulas to manipulate text, things like formulas to figure out how long a piece of text is, or put something all in lowercase, those kinds of things. We also talked about combining formulas. Okay, if you remember our example of creating unique URLs for a bunch of shows, right? We did that by combining some of the formulas we talked about. Concatenate, which is at sort of gluing multiple pieces of text together, lowercase, etc. So that's, I think substitute was another one we talked about, where we were replacing those spaces with an empty string so that our words could come together into a URL format. Okay, so we talked about combining formulas, and then last week, our big topic, if you were here, was talking about VLOOKUP and XLOOKUP. These are two kind of slightly more complicated formulas than the other stuff on this list, but certainly very powerful and lots of use cases, no matter how you're going to go out and use Excel. Okay, so that's kind of where we're at so far. So this is going to be kind of a similar theme to last week. We are going to think of ourselves as working for a large network. We've got, I think, about 500 podcasts in this data set, and we're going to be thinking about some kind of marketing related questions as it pertains to this data set, just as an example, to kind of get through some of these skills that we want to learn. Okay, so one of the main questions that we're going to be focusing around for the first half of our session today is this question. For each category of our shows, we want to find the average number of downloads per month. Okay, so this is a topic that we talked about in the previous session, right? We talked about how to find average of a column. We talked about how to do that with some conditions. But we're going to get into how to do that for each category and how to put that in sort of a clean result format that you might want to share. You could imagine this might be like a report or a summary of the month, something you might be giving to another team, something like that. Okay, so that's the sort of question that we're going to be working on answering in the first part of the session. Okay. All right, so the way that we're going to answer that question is we're going to do it in two ways. The first way we're going to do it is with formulas and with some of the stuff that we learned last week and last 2 weeks, just kind of putting that together. So we're going to walk through that part first. All right, so just to do kind of a quick review of some of the formulas that we talked about last week. All right, if you go to your insert function, you're going to get your kind of menu, your formula builder. You can see all of our different formula options. Okay, as a reminder, right, any formula is going to have your equal sign. It's going to have the name of the function that we're using, and then it's going to take some arguments. Okay, so anything in the parentheses is those arguments that our formula is taking. Okay, these are some examples of formulas that we talked about over the last couple of sessions. I'll just go through a couple of quick examples. So average of D to D, does anyone remember what this letter, colon letter, does anyone remember what that selects in Excel? All right, let's go test it out. So over here, I have just a little sample data set for some demos today. Okay, these are some fake student ID numbers, number of Excel sessions attended, and favorite color. Okay, so did I already do this one? I think I already did this one. So if I want to take the average number of sessions attended, I can use my average formula, which is my formula bar. Okay, we've got my equals average B to B. It means it's just going to take all the data I can find in my B column and take the average. Okay. A couple other formulas we talked about. Count if. I think we might have done this in week 1. All right, so what count if is going to do is going to count all of the data that I provide it based on a condition that I give it in my second argument. Okay, so in this case, I did a little simple count if here. I said I want to count how many students attended more than 2 sessions. Okay, greater than 2. So this is my count if formula. I've got equals, I've got count if, which is my function name. My first argument is again this column B that I grabbed before. And my second argument is the condition. So I can do my little pop-up. I can see, all right, the 2 things this formula needs are the range, right? The column, we already talked about that, and the criteria. Okay, the criteria can either be a piece of text. It can be an expression like it is here, greater than 2 is an expression that's going to define what we're going to count. We don't want to count everything. We just want to count things that are greater than 2. Cool. So if I do that, I get 5. This is a tiny data set, so I can go check with my eyeballs that there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 students that are greater than 2. So I know that that formula is working. Okay. All right, and the last one we're going to review is I had a sum if on here. This is very similar. We also have an average if formula. I think we talked about this last week. All right, so average if is going to be very similar. It's going to say, all right, give me a range of cells, give me a criteria, and then optionally, if I want to take the average of a different range than what I've selected, I can do that. So I started with a simpler example. This one is in brackets, which remember means this is an optional argument. Okay, the ones that aren't in brackets are the only 2 we need to make it work, but there's some cases where we might have this third one. Okay, so average if, I've got equals, average if. My range that I want to give it is all the sessions. And let's say I want to take the average attendance, but I don't want to count this guy who just came to 0 sessions. I don't want to count that into my average. That's going to bring my average down. I'm going to say that that's student unenrolled or something. So I want to take the average attendance, but without this 0. So what I might do is something like this, where I've selected average if. I'm going to grab this set of data. In this case, it's B2 to B9. And I'm going to say, take the average of this range as long as everything is greater than 1. Okay, so I'm essentially taking it out. And we can see, as compared to my thing up here, where I just averaged this whole column, right there, my average was 3. Here, my average is 3.4. Because this one is averaging in the 0, it's bringing my score down a little bit. Okay, so that's a case where we might want to use average if. All right, I know that was kind of a quick review. Any questions about any of those formulas?
Yeah. For the link, like always there's an error of the link. And it's like,
Got it. Are you signed in with your like USC stuff? All right. And is anyone else getting an error on that link as well? Or did anybody get the link to work? 2 people got the link to work. Okay. Let me take one quick look at that. And if not, I may have someone try to just send it to you. Okay, I think that's the most broad I can give it. But yeah, if you're logged in with a USC account, it should work.
can you show the link again?
Yes, there's one on the board right here.
Oh, I see. Yes.
Yeah. Take you to that spot. Yeah, maybe if everyone wants to take a minute, if multiple people are having issues with it, we can figure out something else. Other people getting an error? No, other people getting it to work? All right. Cool, you want to just tell me your email and I can share it with you directly?
Yeah, I'm Lukuan.
Sorry, IOU?
Lukuan.
IOU. Sorry.
LU. Not A.
LU, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Got it.
KUAN.
AUN.
AN.
N.
And ZH.
CH.
Yeah, the first one.
Right, perfect. Is anybody else hitting an error with this link? Send it to you also. Okay. Cool. All right. Okay, so this is kind of a quick review. We talked about these formulas in previous weeks, and we're about to kind of get into them with a little bit of practice as we set up our first table. All right. Okay, this is just kind of a general heads up for all the data we're going to be working with today. We've talked about this in our previous sessions. We want to have a header on every column. We want to have a proper format on each of our numbers, right? If we're working with dollar amounts, we want to set them as currency. If we're working with dates, we want to make sure that's appropriate. We want to make sure we have the appropriate number of decimal places in our data. This is all kind of presentation stuff. Our focus for today is building tables, but it's going to be a little bit more with the focus of once we build the table, we want to have a nice clean end product that we could give to someone who might be a little less familiar with data, who might not understand why there's a bunch of decimal points going out longer than is needed. So just these are some kind of general notes as we go today. Let's use these built-in functions that we have to keep things nice and neat. I think we didn't maybe talk last time. If you want your numbers to have thousand separators, so if you want them to have the commas between the thousands or not, there's different cases where you may want that. There's an option, there's a comma button in your formatting toolbar that you can use to turn that on or off. And then same thing with your decimal places, right? We can turn those up or down. So for example, in my thing here, I can say, all right, I really just want to know 3.4 would be a fine average. I don't need this level of detail on this one. So I see I've got my decrease and increase decimal options here, and I can use these to shrink that down if I just wanted to have one decimal place. So just some little formatting stuff, but can make your end product a lot nicer. Okay. We'll come back to format as table when we loop around. Okay. So we're gonna do a little activity. I'm gonna walk you through a little demo of this first, and then I'll have you all give this a try. So what we're gonna be answering with this first activity is that question that I mentioned at the beginning. We wanna know how many downloads on average is each podcast getting by category. Okay, so our podcast might be true crime, it might be science, it might be comedy, right? And we wanna know how many downloads is our podcast getting on average within each of those categories. So I'm going to show you an example of how we might do that with a simpler data set. Okay, here we've got a very simple data set. We've got students' favorite colors and how many sessions they attended. Maybe I want to know for all the students whose favorite color was purple, how many sessions on average did they attend? Okay, this is a similar question, right? I'm using colors instead of categories. This is just a simpler example. Okay, so if I wanted to do that, I wanted to take the average attendance for people whose favorite color is purple. What formula that we've already talked about today might I use for that? I want to take the average based on a condition. Average if, great, okay. Very good. So I'm going to do an average if. This is similar to my example earlier. So what I've done here is I've just said, all right, I see in this column purple. So I'm going to make my little data table here, favorite color. This little table that I'm making off to the side is going to be this final thing that I want to present, okay, my final report. And then I'm going to use my average if formula. All right, so very similar here. I'm going to say average if. I click in so I get my little pop-up. All right, so I'm going to give it a range of where to go look for this criteria. I'm going to give it the criteria. And in this case, I want it to go take the average somewhere else. Because what I want it to do is look in column C to see what the favorite colors are. I want it to look in G3 for the criteria. So in this case, the criteria is equals whatever is in G3, which is purple. So it's looking at column C. It says, what are all the people whose favorite color is purple? And then I want to take the average of their attendance, and their attendance lives in column B. Okay, so this is where I'm using this third argument. I don't want to take the average of purple, purple, red, green, because that's not an average. That's not, I can't take an average of colors. So I'm going to take my average in this third argument here of the cells that I want the average of, which in this case is attendance. All right, so if I do that, I say I get 2.33. Let's go like check that with our eyeballs. So for the people whose favorite color is purple, they attended 2 sessions, 3 sessions, 2 sessions. Yeah, so the average should be a little over 2. Looks good. Okay. I can also do a little cleanup here. Maybe I want to get rid of some of these decimal places. Just keep my final report kind of clean. Okay, so I want to do that for each color in my list here. This is the concept of making a data table, right? We're summarizing the information that we have. So I could do this. I could just scan with my eyeballs down for the next color, which is red, next color, which is blue. All right, but you can imagine that would get kind of annoying to find all the unique ones if I've got a big data set we're about to do. Okay. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this, my favorite color data, and I'm going to make a copy of it over here. Normally, when we're summarizing data, you want to keep a copy of your raw data, maybe in another tab or just another part of your sheet, and then do your summary table elsewhere, so that if anything gets messed up, you can always go back to your original raw data. Good data practice. Okay. So I'm going to come in here to my color data, and I want to find my unique values here, which means I want to remove the duplicates, right? I don't want purple 3 times in this row. I just want purple once because I'm going to take the average. So you can go in your data ribbon at the top, and there's a very fun built-in tool for this called Remove Duplicates. Great. And it's going to give you an option to either just look at the data that you already selected when you clicked this button, or expand it. So it's going to try to guess whether you meant to select more data than you did. In this case, I did not, so I'm going to click my original selection. If I had selected my header column, I could turn this on or off to include my header, and then I'm going to hit OK. So I went to my data ribbon, I hit Remove Duplicates. I decided to go through what data I already had selected, and then I'm going to hit OK. All right, then I'm going to get this really handy pop-up that says 4 duplicate values found, 4 unique values remain. Awesome. All right, and so now I've got my list of all the unique colors that showed up over here, but it got rid of the duplicates. All right, so you can imagine if I'm creating some sort of final report, I would just want for each of these colors, the average attendance, right? That would be like a little neat final table that it would kind of summarize this data set I could provide to someone who's interested. So I already have this formula, which means I can paste it down to these other colors. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. If you hover on the corner and double click, it'll paste your formula down. All right, and then one more topic to review from last week. We see here for this purple row, it's taking the average of cells C2 to C9, right? Which is great. That's where our data set lives. But when I copied our formula down, this formula is taking the average of rows 3 through 10. Yeah, so it's skipping the top row. Does anyone remember how we avoid skipping the top row? We sort of glue our formula in place from last week.
It's the dollar mark.
Dollar signs, yes. Okay, so before we copy paste our formula down, so I'm gonna undo that I just did. Before you copy paste your formula down, you wanna think about which of these you want to logically move down and which you don't. Okay, now for C2 through C9, my data is staying there. That's my whole data set. I don't want that data to move. So I'm gonna glue those in place with my dollar signs, okay? Now G3, in the next row, I actually want it to look at G4 because in the next row, I want it to be red, okay? So this one, I'm not gonna put a dollar sign because I want this one, when I paste the formula into the next row, to move down like it did automatically. Now with B2 and B9, same thing. I wanna glue those in place with my C2 and C9 so that they're not missing data. So I'm putting my dollar signs to avoid that happening. All right, I'm gonna do that. You'll see it didn't change my purple response. That makes sense. But when I paste this down, you can also just grab the corner and drag. That does the same thing. I can go look at my formula and I see, okay, it kept C2 to C9 and B2 to B9, but it went from G3 in my formula bar up here to G4, which is exactly what I wanted it to do. Okay, so now we have average attendance by favorite color. Cool. All right, so that was kind of a silly example, but to show you what the steps we're about to walk through with your bigger data set, okay? So the data set for this week, which is at this link, it's on the whiteboard as well. You're gonna do that same set of steps that I just did on our data set of shows. All right, so since this is a bigger data set, I would advise creating a new tab or a new sheet in your workbook. You're going to get a unique list of all the categories. So you're going to use that remove duplicates tool. Then we want to find out how many shows are in each category and what their average monthly downloads are using those count if, average if formulas. Okay. And then we'll do some formatting stuff once we've got that going. So your data for this week is in this sheet. For this one, we're going to be on our shows tab or shows sheet, which has our shows by category. Okay, so use backup. Remember to create a copy of that sheet in your own Excel or download a copy. And you're going to create a new tab, get a list of all those categories, and then work on a couple of formulas so we know how many shows and their average downloads. So I will give you all a couple of minutes to get started on it. Does anyone think they have the number of shows by category? You got it? All right. All right, shows by category. We got a few people. Got there? Yeah? All right. You want to tell us how you got there?
Equals.
All right, I guess first we got to do our categories, right? So let me do that. Okay, so to get my unique categories, I'm going to copy this column of categories. I'm going to go to a new sheet down here. All right, I'm going to paste that on in. I'm going to go to my data ribbon. At the top, I'm going to do remove duplicates. Depending on the size of your toolbar here, this might just be this little icon with the red X, so you might have to look around for it. All right, do my remove duplicates. In this case, my data does have headers, so I'm going to check this box. The word category doesn't appear anywhere else, so we would probably just leave it, but I can check it. All right, great. 11 values remain. Awesome. Cool. All right. Tell me your formula.
Equals count if.
Count if.
Shows.
Shows. So I'm gonna go over here to my shows sheet.
G2 to G501.
Perfect. 2 to 501. This might just work if I leave it as G to G, but that works as well.
To add the dollar sign.
All right, perfect. That and the dollar signs. All right.
And comma A2.
A2 because in my format or in my sheet here, A2 is what this category is. So if I'm doing, let me label my column number of shows. You double click between your columns, it'll auto do the width to the widest piece of text that you have. Kind of nice. Okay, because A2 is going to be this value true crime. So that's the if, that's the criteria that it's looking for to count my shows. Okay, great. I've got that. So I'm going to paste this formula on down my row here. All right, looks like we had a blank, so it's going to not automatically go down. So I'm going to drag it a little bit further. Okay, great. All right, I'm going to delete my blank row. Looks like our categories may be missing on a few shows. Delete this row. Okay. All right, so you should have something that looks like this. We have 10 different categories total, so you should have something that's about 10 rows long like this. And then your count if should be getting your number of shows. Make sure that you're doing either just the column or that you've got your dollar signs to make sure that that data window isn't moving down. All right. Is anyone stuck on this? Anyone getting an error? Any questions about count if? All right, did anyone get the average number of monthly downloads by category? All right, you got average number of monthly downloads? All right, you want to tell us what you did? Equals average if.
Show.
All right, over to my shows.
Mark. And we have G and dollar mark 2 till G dollar mark 1.
All right, G2 to G501, and I'm going to do my dollar signs to make sure that I'm locking that in. Okay.
Sheet 1, choose A2.
All right, sheet 1, go to A2 because that's my category name. Great.
And then go back to shows table and choose the F and also dollar mark 2 till F dollar mark 501.
Perfect. All right, same deal here. So I'm going to do dollar sign F, dollar sign 2 to F, 5, $ again, 501. All right, so column G here is looking at the category. Our second argument is telling us which category to filter by. And then that last argument is telling us what we actually want to take the average of, which in this case is our downloads number. Okay. I'm going to hit that. Great. Paste that on down. Awesome. Okay, so you should have something that looks something like this. Woo. Okay. All right. So this is kind of a standard summary table you might do for any sort of data set, right? Okay, so a couple other kind of like cleanup formatting things I would probably do before I present this to anyone. I would come in here and make these decimal numbers consistent. Now, this is the kind of thing that depends on context. So in the podcasting industry, a download either happened or it didn't. There's no concept of a partial download. That's just not a thing. So because of that, if you have a thing that doesn't come in parts, you typically don't want to show decimals. So what I'm going to do here is decrease the decimal until I'm just left with my whole numbers. That's going to make more sense for this context. All right, and I'm going to keep them formatted as a number, which they already are. I can look if there's any other number formats I want to use. In this case, I want to use my 1000 separator because these are kind of big numbers. It's a little easier for the eyeball to see if it's more or less than a million if there's commas. So I'm going to throw in my 1000 separator just because that's kind of a personal preference, but kind of up to you. All right. All right. And then there's a couple of other kind of formatting choices you can make here. There's a format as table button somewhere. I'm not seeing my web version. Sorry, I only know where this one is on the desktop. Here we go. Okay, format as table. It's going to be a little bit over from your number formatting menu. All right, so I can select my data and I can choose some different formats that I might want my table to show up in. Maybe I like this one. Okay, great. It's going to ask you if you have headers. Cool. And then it'll do some like nifty little formatting for you. It's making the headers bold. It's doing that in a darker color. It's doing these alternating rows, which is nice if somebody's going to be like reading it with their eyeballs. So format as table is just kind of a nice like little final touch you can put on any data that you're presenting. And also you'll remember in week 1, we talked about sort and filter. So once you format it as a table, it's going to automatically give you the little arrows at the top, which will allow you to do your sorting and filtering. Also a nice touch to already have those set up if you're going to be like putting together a sheet to share with somebody else. So all I did for that is my home ribbon and then format as table, and you can choose any of the formats you like. There's a bunch of options. Okay, even if you're not going to fully format as a table, I would definitely recommend bolding the headers and doing the our sort and filter option to make sure that you've got these nice little drop downs for any kind of final product report. Cool. Okay, any questions about how we got to this table? Any error messages, anything like that? Okay, feeling okay so far? Nodding heads. Okay, great. All right. Oh, I guess last thing we could do, one other kind of like last nice thing would be to have this data already sorted before I share it with somebody. So maybe I want to sort by my category that has the largest shows on average. So I'm going to sort mine. Okay, great. So I can see that my technology shows, it just in our podcast network, it just happens to be that our technology, health, and true crime shows are the largest. All right. Great. Okay, so next we're going to talk about pivot tables, which pivot tables accomplish everything that we just did, but much more easily and faster. Okay, so the reason that we walked through that was both to give you a little formula review refresher, but also so you can understand the mechanics of what the pivot table is doing behind the scenes and why it's so great for this type of use case. Okay, so pivot tables are essentially doing some formulas for you under the hood, and they're adding a bunch of other features that make it easy to quickly change your what you've done. So you could imagine you did all this work you did by category. You've got this nice little table that we just created. We probably spent 10 minutes doing that. And then your boss says, okay, great, but I'd actually like to see this data by the country that the host is located in instead of category. With the work that we just did, you would have to do that all over from scratch, right? With a pivot table, that's actually like a really quick, just sort of few clicks to change something like that out. So I'm going to show you what a pivot table looks like. You're going to have in your insert ribbon, you're going to have a pivot table option. You're going to select your data and then you're going to pop it into your sheet. So just to show you on my little silly data set here, I'm going to select these 3 columns. These are my, my little data set, and I'm going to go insert pivot table. Typically, you want to put your pivot table in a new worksheet, so it'll kind of like open a new tab for you so you can play around. This is such a tiny data set for demo purposes that I'm just going to put it over here on my little sheet. And then it's going to give me this little blank box type of thing that looks like this. And it's going to give me my little field list over on the side. So whenever I'm building a pivot table, I'm going to get these 4 options that I can set up. So the options I can set up are any filters. So any of these fields that I want to filter by. I can set up what I want to appear in the rows of my table. So in our example, we did favorite color, right, was our rows. I can say what I want my columns to be. So if I want to also split it by, let's say I had favorite color and pet and a bunch of other stuff, right, I could go across with some other data attribute if I wanted. And then what are my values? So am I taking the average? Am I taking a count? Am I adding them up? What kind of summary function do I want to use? Okay. So this is a very simple data set. So we'll just do a very simple example. We'll do the same one that I did earlier. So I'm going to say favorite color I want to be my rows, and you're just dragging and dropping. This is not like state of the art high tech. Okay, this is just dragging and dropping from this little list of options over to here. Okay, so I'm going to grab my favorite color and drop it into rows, and we see it pops up with this. So it already did that like whole remove duplicate step that we did manually. It's doing that for us. All right, and then I'm going to want average attendance. So attendance is my value that I want. So I'm going to drop that into my values section. Okay, when I drop it into my values section, I get some kind of further options. So I get my little drop down here, and I can choose some settings. All right, so I can tell it here what kind of formula I want it to do. So in this case, I want my average, but I could do count, what's the maximum? We've got a whole list of some other statistical stuff here, depending on what you're working on. For the purpose of this example, I'm going to click average. And we're going to do okay. All right, great. And I should get very similar results to what I did before. Now, the pivot table automates a lot of stuff, but it does not automate the formatting. So same deal if I want, those decimal places to just go down to 1 decimal place, I'll still need to go up and use my formatting bar. That, for the purposes of this, we'll make these whole numbers. All right, so now I've got my little table. Same thing as we did here, but a lot simpler, right? I didn't have to actually type in any formulas myself. It also comes with some little kind of built-in sort filter stuff, which is nice. So I can do my normal sort filtering. I can also sort either by my row, so by my favorite color, or I can sort by value, right? So I can sort by the average sessions attended, and it understands if I want to go ascending or descending. Just do some nice little sorting stuff. All right, this is great because if you want to change or add any information here, you're just dragging and dropping. You don't have to muck around with your formulas. So we have an average number of sessions attended. Let's say we also want the number of students. All I need to do for that is say, let's count the student IDs. So I'm going to drag my student IDs also into my values. I can have multiple values. All right, it's defaulting to sum. Taking the sum of student IDs doesn't really conceptually make sense because those are random numbers. So I'm going to come in here and change this to count. Hit OK. Great, and now we have how many students fall into each category in addition to the average number of sessions. And we could have done that with formula, right? We could have done that with the count if, but this is a little simpler, a little easier, faster to change, stuff like that. And you'll notice it's also doing these nice column headers for me as well. So it's doing a little summary of whatever function you picked and then whatever the column title was that you had before, which is a good reason to make sure you have good column headers in your original data. You can pull it automatically to stuff like this. right, has anyone done pivot tables before? Is this a review for anybody? This is, okay, cool. All right, so we are going to play with some pivot tables ourselves on our data set, okay? All right, this is what we just walked through, right? So you're dragging and dropping your filters, columns, rows, values thing might look like this depending on the layout of your screen, but same thing. You're going to be dragging and dropping any of these fields into any of these sections. Okay, in general, for simple tables, you're going to want your rows and values. As your tables get more complicated, you might use filters and columns as well. But as soon as you're making changes in this list, you'll see them pop up on the screen, which is pretty cool. All right, we just talked about this. I'm gonna come back to this part. We talked about sorting. Okay, so I'm gonna have you all take a stab at making a pivot table. So I would like you to make a pivot table that does exactly what we just did with formulas in the last exercise. So I'd like you to select all your shows data and insert a pivot table, have it go to a new sheet. And I want you to make this same chart that we just made manually. So number of shows by category and average monthly downloads by category. I want you to do that with a pivot table. Okay. You should get the same results that you got doing it with your formulas, but once you have the pivot table, we're going to play with it a little more. Okay. All right. Does anyone have their pivot table? Just their basic part. We can get into the rest of this in a second. Anyone have their basic pivot table? Yeah? Okay, cool. So you should have something like this. I'm going to select all my show data. I'm going to do Command A as my little keyboard shortcut. I'm going to go Insert, Pivot Table, and I'm going to do this in a new worksheet. I have such a big data set. It's kind of a better practice to do it in a new sheet. All right, got my pivot table. I've got my fields, and I've got my field, my little pivot table builder. Okay. So I want my rows to be my categories. So I'm going to drag and drop category over to rows. Boom, that's going to update. Pretty cool. I'm going to say I want my average of my monthly downloads. I'm going to grab that down into values. And I want to change it from sum to average. I'm going to do that with my little pop-up here. I think on Max, it shows up as a little I instead of an arrow. Grab that. I'm going to say switch this to my average. Okay, great. And then same thing, it's not going to automatically do any formatting. So I'm just going to get rid of my decimal places. Got a little neater. Okay, and then I also want how many shows. So I'm just going to do the count of the title or the ID. It doesn't really matter what I'm counting because I'm just counting how many there are. I can count a title. Put that down here. Great. It's going to do count. Awesome. And then I've got my little pop-up filter and sort here, which it's already got. So I can say, all right, I want to sort it by the number of shows. So if I say by value, it's going to let me pick which of my values I want to sort by. I'm going to say that I want it by count and I want my largest category first. Okay, now I could have just sorted by my categories alphabetically with the regular sort ascending, but that's not that meaningful for this data set. So I'm going to sort them by value. Okay, does everybody have a pivot table that looks something like this? Does anybody's table not look like this? Anyone's table not look like this? Right. Okay, let's talk about a little bit more stuff that we can do with this table. Okay, so the other thing that's cool about pivot tables is it has some other built-in functions that save you some manual math. So let's say we've got 500 shows total. We want to know what % of our shows are business or comedy, not just how many. It's got some handy built-in stuff to do things like that for us. So if I go back to my podcast title, I'm going to go back to my little settings right here on that field in my field builder. I can choose how I want my value to show up. All right, so under my show value as option, I have all of my different options. In general, % of grand total is the one you'd use the most, but if we think about this, our grand total is 500 podcasts. We want to know what % is 62 podcasts. So if I switch this to % and I hit OK, this is going to give me my percentages. Now, I already rounded this number down to no decimal places, so my percentages are all showing up as 0. So as a number formatting thing, I want to select this, go back up to my number formats and make sure it's set to show as a %. Okay, if I set it to show as a %, because if you remember a percent, 100% is equivalent to 1, so 3% is 0.03. So when I was rounding those places, it was just rounding them down. All right, now that I've got my percentages though, I don't want the decimals. So now I'm going to get rid of my decimals again, but I just have my nice, neat, tidy percentage numbers. Okay, if you click out of your pivot table at any point, your little field builder thing is going to disappear. To get back to it, you just click back into your table and you're going to get your little field builder to pop back up. Okay, so if you lose your builder, just click back into your table. You'll also notice that whenever you're in a pivot table, you're going to get this extra option in your ribbon called pivot table, which is going to give you some extra options up here. You can also get, if you really lose your field list, you can come back to your pivot table ribbon and turn your field list on and off right here so that you can find this little pop-up. Okay. Did everyone get their show as % to work? Does everyone have a percentage column like this? Yeah, question.
Do the percentage part again?
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so this is if I've got it as a count in my, so if I had my average downloads and then I have my count here, all I want to do is go in my field list to the value that I want to change. So in this case, it's count of title. You should have a little arrow or an I button right here where you can go to your settings. Once I'm in my settings, I can choose how to show my value. So my show value as. And the most common one I use in this list is % of grand total. But you could imagine if you had a more complicated data set with subgroups, you could just do % of basically a smaller subgroup. In this case, I'm just going to do % of grand total. And if you get a bunch of zeros right here, just remember that that's because that's how it shows up as a number. So it's going to show up as these, or if you have it rounded down to one place, they'll show up as zeros. So the last very formatting step I did here is just to change these to format as a % so that my 0.09 instead appears as 9%. Get rid of my decimal places so it rolls back up. Any questions about that? Anyone getting an error message? Okay, cool. All right. Now, where pivot tables get really powerful, right? Because essentially what we just did is we recreated this thing that we did with formulas. I'm gonna rename my sheets here so we can keep track of them. I'm gonna call this one, you can just double click on these to rename them. I'm gonna call this pivot. This one, just call summary. Okay, that's the first one that we did. This is my pivot table. What's really cool about this is how easily you can edit, right? So let's say we also wanted to break this data down by release day, right? We have information about our shows, about which day of the week they tend to be released. It might be interesting to see if shows that are released on a certain day maybe tend to have more downloads. Maybe a lot of people listen to podcasts on Mondays. I don't know. All right, so with your pivot table, that's super easy because I can just take release day and add it as another breakdown in my rows. And then I can see it's giving me these subgroups. So it's going to give me of all my business podcasts, this many of my business podcasts that are released on Mondays. Here's the average downloads. My business podcast released on Tuesdays, etc. So it does look like for business podcasts, the ones with more downloads tend to be posted on Mondays. Now, I don't know. We could argue about whether that's because they're posted on Mondays or just the biggest shows happen to be on Mondays. Right? This doesn't tell us which way that goes, but that's kind of interesting. This is a case where we might want to change our percent of grand total. So I might come over here to my count of podcast title and play around with my little settings over here. Maybe I want to show my value as a percent of my row. All right. Across, I could do my percent. All right, so what it's doing here is it's just looking across each row, right? Which in this case, each row is just itself. So we're getting one of each. Maybe in this case, it's a little more useful if I just go back to my count. So let's do that. All right. And I'm gonna come back down here to my settings. I'm gonna do my show value as, and I'm gonna take this percentage off. So I'm just gonna go back to no calculation, which is how I get back to my regular count. All right, and you'll notice these numbers look super weird. They're still showing up as percentages. So now that I've switched this back to just count of shows, I actually wanna come up here and reformat my number. I'm gonna say this isn't percent anymore. This is just a number. It gets me back down to the right number of shows. Same thing, I want to get rid of my decimal points because there's no such thing as a fractional show. Okay. All right, so this format is a little funky. I could have decided that I want my release day to be a column. I want that to go across, which would essentially show me the same breakdown, but a little bit transposed. All right, so I can try that really easily by just dragging release day over to my columns. All right, and then it's going to do it this way. So it's going to say for Sunday, for business, here's my average of monthly downloads, here's my count. So because there are no business podcasts released on Sunday, makes sense, these are blank. But if we go down to say technology, there is a podcast, which it looks like exactly one that's released on Sundays in the technology category. And this is its downloads or its average downloads, or its multiple. Okay, so I could play with that. It might be a little hard to see, right? Because I've got these kind of two different values that I'm looking at. Maybe that's a lot. Maybe I want to get rid of my average monthly downloads. I can just drag it back over in my field builder. I just dragged it out of values back to my field list. And now I've got this pretty cool table that is all my categories of shows by which day they're released. And you can see it's giving me subtotals. So of all 500 shows, only 6 are released on Sundays. Looks like most are released on Wednesdays. All right, so it's giving me subtotals for each row, subtotals for each column, and a grand total down here of my 500 shows. All right, so I can play with this as much as I want, right? I can bring my monthly downloads back, I can get rid of my podcast count, I can make it a percentage, I can play around with a bunch of different display options here, but this is really cool because when you have it in this format, it's much, much easier to make edits for if someone else wants to see this and maybe they want it sorted a different way. This is a great way that you can kind of manipulate data yourself, but also share data with other folks. All right. So hopefully if you weren't doing that as I was talking, definitely try like dragging and dropping some fields around so you can kind of get a feel for what this looks like, some different options. Can add a filter. Let's say I wanted to be able to filter by category. I can put that up here. That'll give me a little pop-up built-in filter. And I can say maybe I want to know the summary of everything, but I want to take out these business podcasts. I don't like those. I want to take those out. And when I remove those, here's my average by release day. Looks like the switch to sum. That's an easy fix though. I can come back down to my settings and my values and change this back to average. All right, great. And then I've got my little filter right here, so I can change my filter whenever I want, and my data underneath will change. Say we want to get rid of these education ones also, and we'll see my numbers update. This, it's back in rows. All right. Any questions about moving stuff around in your pivot table, displaying stuff differently, any of that? All right, main thing to remember is if you're changing anything where you want to change the formatting, like if you're changing to percents or you're changing back and forth from averages or anything like that, your number formatting for pivot tables is still going to happen in that same number format menu we've been using this whole time. So if I want to come in here and I want to add those commas in, for example, I can do that. And get rid of these bullet points. Great. So any number format stuff is going to happen there, especially if you're switching back and forth from percentages. That's something you have to pay attention to. Yeah, question.
For the pivot table, like there's like limitation for the formula that can be used, right? Or we can put whatever we want just to add.
Yeah, so you can add stuff onto your pivot table, totally. So let's say I wanted to do like something else on the side. Maybe I wanted to get the length of the category name. I don't know. It's not really something you'd want to do, but for whatever formula you'd want to put here. Yeah, you can do something like this, right? Which is like, you know, add some other formula, add your own column. Totally. If you do something like this, though, you have to be careful because with your pivot table, let's say if you want to move your category back down to a column, any sort of move like that that you do is going to get you an error because it's going to overlap with stuff you already have. So in general, what I would recommend if you want to do something like that, sort of combine formulas, I would get your pivot table to where you want it. I usually then like paste that to a different sheet so that it's just its own table, just its own numbers, loses all the pivot functionality, and then add stuff to it from there. Yeah, because otherwise either it'll give you that warning that it's going to overwrite or it just will overwrite and then you'll lose anything else you added. Yeah. Questions about pivot tables? All right. Cool. All right, so yeah, we kind of already talked about this, but this is the kind of question that we can answer really quickly with pivot tables. Any sort of related questions, the analysis that you already did is great. So for example, we're trying to sell an advertisement to our news shows. It's a product that is going to get announced next Wednesday. So we specifically want to look at those shows. That's super easy with our pivot table, right? We could just say category, news. Okay, on average, those shows get 407,000 downloads. If I want the sum, all I got to do is pop in here, switch it to sum. Easy peasy. We've got, 7 million downloads of new shows that are released on Wednesdays. Cool. Another formatting note, right? If I get this like weird pound signs thing come up, I can double click up here or I can manually drag and it'll display my number. It's just going to do that if the number is too large for the width. Okay. All right, cool. All right. Okay, so as I mentioned, right, once you're in your pivot table, you're going to get this extra bar at the top of your ribbon, this extra like ribbon section, I guess it's called, which is going to give you more options for your pivot table. And you're also going to get a little design tab. So once I'm in my pivot table, so you'll notice if I click into just like a random cell up in my ribbon, I have view, help, draw, and then nothing else. If I click back into my pivot table, I have view, help, draw, pivot table, right? So it like shows up only when I'm in my little table. I'm gonna come up here, and depending on your setup, you might have analyze and design as two separate little sub tabs, or you might have it all as one. That just depends on your edition of Excel. Back to my data. But I can do my same little like formatting stuff if I want, right? So I can do the like format as table thing that we just did with our regular table. I could do that same formatting type of thing here, and this will automatically update as I make changes to my pivot table. Just kind of, yeah, I want to make it orange today. And yeah, it'll just do some like nice little formatting stuff. All right. All right, next thing that we're gonna do is add a chart. Okay, so one of the main reasons you might wanna make a table is because you wanna eventually summarize all that stuff into a chart. So we are gonna talk about that with our pivot table. So from my pivot table and the pivot table that you have as well, I can come up here. I have my insert. All right, and I should get my insert chart button. Sorry, this is me finding a button on desktop versus the web browser version of this. I think it's here. Yeah, here we go. All right. Great, so from my pivot table, I can come in and insert whatever type of chart that I would like. So let's make sure I have all my data selected. Let's say I want to come in here and do we'll start with like a simple chart. Do a column chart. Okay, great. So I'm gonna select my data, I'm gonna grab my chart, and this is gonna float on top of my cells, so I can put this anywhere you want. You might have done charts like this in PowerPoint or Word. Also, there's like chart features for Microsoft or Google stuff that's very similar. But you'll see this is gonna take all my data from my pivot table and just put it into visual chart form. So it's gonna adjust based on the changes that I make up here. I've got my category, I've got my release day, and I could change my chart type as well. Once you have a chart, same thing with your upper ribbon, you're gonna get a different little ribbon section called chart. And then you can always come up here and change your chart type. Let's say I wanted a bar chart instead of this, switch and go sideways. So as long as my chart's selected, I can come up with my chart ribbon and I can change my options with my chart. Okay, so go ahead and play around with that a little bit. You can play around with your pivot table and then play around with your chart, get some different options. And then of course, within your chart, we have a bunch of formatting. You can usually get to the formatting in this by either double clicking or from your chart ribbon, same deal. So if I just want to change my chart title, I can double click right here. It'll let me do a little edit. So I could say something descriptive like shows by category and release day. Great. All right, same deal. I can change my color scheme. So go ahead and try adding a chart just so you can get a feel for how that works. Play around. Did anyone not get a chart to pop up? Any errors trying to get a chart? Okay, so basically the difference to know with charts and pivot tables is much like your pivot table. If you're using a pivot chart, it's going to update right along with your chart. We could also have put a chart right for this little manual table that we did at the beginning of class. So I want to come in here, I want to do insert chart. We'll do something like this. Right, this is great, this is cool, this is here. I can, if I make any like manual edits to my table for this chart, it should update. So let's say I change this to 100. I should be able to come over here to my chart. I can come over here to my data. Great, and as long as my data is still selected, this should update. Oh, I guess this is why the number of shows, so it's really tiny. That wasn't a good one to update. Let's do this. Let's make this one bigger, just for purposes of demo. Okay, but basically, I don't know why it's not letting me edit. The browser's being a little slow right now. Okay, but so basically any data that I have here, let's say I changed my formula. So let's try, we do it now. Yes, okay, so this is average if. You could imagine if we had changed this to a count if. My chart should update alongside. That's great, but this is going to be a little bit less flexible than my pivot table with my pivot chart. Okay. All right. All right, so yeah, so go ahead and take a minute and play around. So do a table based on, or do a chart based on your table from the beginning of class. Do a pivot chart based on your pivot table. Take a second to just play around. Try a donut chart or pie chart. Yeah. Yes, okay, so you should be able just to, in your title. Oh, great, okay, so if your chart is missing a title, this is a good question. If anybody else is having this, you can go up to your chart ribbon and you should be able to, there's a few different ways that shows up, but you might get your chart title button, in which case you can choose none or where you want it to display. The other way that you might see it is under design. So if you're on a Mac and you're on the desktop version, it should be under design and you should be able to do chart element. And that should give you like right here, chart element, and that should let you add title, axis title, turn that stuff on or off. All right, so here for me, it's just showing up as its own little ribbon. So I could do that here. I could say I want axis titles, title below. And then I could say I want to add this one, I'm gonna call it average downloads. Hit OK, and then it updates my little chart, shows up. All right, so try adding some formatting, tuning your colors around. Can add a legend, remove a legend. Try some of the different plot types. All right, I'll give everybody a minute to try that. Yeah, question.
I had a problem creating a
Okay.
and I chose the data set.
Okay, so you'll notice that it's trying to put your data set in your existing worksheet. So it's trying to put it right on top of the data that you've selected. So let's go to do it in a new sheet. Oh, I think I see what happened. I think you had the whole sheet selected, which means you also had columns over here that aren't labeled. So when you're selecting your data, I do Command A, and then it's just going to grab this sort of set of data that's all populated. Yeah,
Oh,
okay, so just make sure you're not, when you're creating your pivot table, make sure you're not selecting all those empty columns over to the top. Your pivot table is not going to like that because when you're building your table, it needs to tell you each field or attribute name in this list. So if your headers are blank, this part doesn't work. So it's going to give you an error either when you're creating it or sometimes it gives you an error here. So if you're getting that error, try selecting just your data that's populated before you create your pivot table. Questions? Yeah.
It is possible for us to put all the chart into a new sheet. Like I create like different chart for different sheet and I put it together in the new sheet.
Yes,
like a
and that is exactly the focus of our session next week. But yes, you can, yeah, so you can move your stuff around same way like when we do our formulas, for example, where's this guy? Like, yeah, like our formulas here are referring back to data that's on our other sheet. Same deal, we can like arrange, move things around. Yeah. Yeah, well, that's kind of like the project we'll get into in the next session. But yeah, you can move stuff wherever you want it. No reason it has to be on the same. Yeah, question.
So is there any way we can get all the slides from the previous class in this?
Yeah, absolutely. It should be in the same link where the recordings are stored on the Annenberg DL website. I think it should go in the same place. I don't know if they're already there from last week or not. But yes, you should be able to get them there. I'll follow up and make sure they get posted. Right. Yeah, question.
Transferable are the skills we learned here in Excel applicable to sheets?
Great question. Everything we just did also happens in Google Sheets. So the pivot tables exist in Google Sheets. We can actually go look at that. I think I had. Let's have the Google Sheet version of this open. Another window. Okay, here, let me bring this one over just so you can see. So in Google Sheets, it's extremely similar. Tab in here, so you can see the Google Sheets version. Cool, extremely similar. So I can select all my data. I can go insert pivot table. So the menu, like again, the menus and stuff are going to be slightly different, but I can do that. Same thing, new or existing sheet, do my new sheet. And yeah, I get my same rows, columns, values, filters. I can drag and drop my attributes. Google's going to try to be a little smart and give you like some suggestions. You're going to take or leave. You could do the same drag and drop thing, right? I could say I want to do my values or the count of the title, and then I want to do my column or my rows by category. Yeah, all the same thing that we did. You can see visually it just looks a little different. And same thing, you click out of it and your little menu thing will go away. If you click back into it, your little menu thing will come back up. Yeah, and all the formatting stuff is like kind of similar, it's just a bit like, gotta figure out which button it is in the toolbar. Just about everything should be about the same. All right. Did everybody successfully get at least one chart to show up? Cool. Great. Okay, so next thing, the kind of an important like nuance to know of pivot tables, and I'm glad you brought up Google Sheets. That's a good transition to this. This is like one of the few areas where Google Sheets and Excel are a little different. So once your pivot table is created, you've told it the source data to draw from, it drew a copy of that source data, and then it's doing whatever summarizing you've asked it to do. If you add or edit any data to your source, your pivot table is not going to pick it up until you hit the pivot table refresh button. It's a little annoying. That's how it works in Excel. In Google Sheets, it will automatically update if you update your source data, but in Excel, it will not. So just to show you an example of what that looks like in my pivot table that I have here. Let's say I go in, here, let me do a number. I'm going to switch this back to number of shows just for the purposes of this demo. All right. And you'll see that my table, right, has been updating right alongside me as I've been just making some little changes. All right, so let's see. Looks like I have this many podcasts total because I think I'm still filtering some out. Is that true? Maybe this is just filtering my. Okay. So, all right, so I could go back to my source data and let's say that I delete some shows. Okay, I delete some shows. I've changed my source data that my pivot table is pulling from. I go back to my pivot table and it's remained unchanged. Okay. Oh, I am filtering a category. That's why. All right. So my pivot table still thinks I have 500 shows, even though I just went to my shows tab and deleted 6 of my shows. Right. It's not going to update unless I tell it to refresh. So when you're making changes, it's sort of assuming that your source data is like fixed and then any changes are happening in the pivot table side. So if you have to go back and edit or add or change, remove data from your source that the pivot table is drawing from, you have to tell it that. So in your pivot table, that's going to happen in your pivot table ribbon up here. The very first button, I think in most editions, it should be the first button, but it'll have the round arrows is your refresh button. So if I come in and refresh my pivot table, then you'll see the number updated from 500 down to 494 because I deleted my 6 rows. Okay. I can undo that. Oh no, it can't be undone. Oh no. Okay, well, too bad. All right, so I'm down to 494 rows in this data set because I refreshed my pivot table. If I hadn't hit that refresh button, this would still say 500. Okay. All right, and this is the case where Google Sheets will do it differently. Okay, next thing you could imagine on your data set, you might add rows. So we're a podcast network. We have a bunch of shows. Let's say we add, I shift command down to go down to the bottom. I'm going to add my 501st show. I'm going to call it My Awesome Podcast. And let's say that it is True Crime. Okay. So once I've added this podcast, I go back to my pivot table. I go back to my pivot table ribbon at the top and hit refresh. And so I should expect I just added a show. This should go from 494 to 495. I'm gonna hit refresh and then no change. It did not change. So if you're changing the data kind of area, you can think of it like whatever you selected to create your pivot table, you're gonna need to tell it that again explicitly if you make any changes. So to do that, you can go to your change data source button. And this is where it kind of comes together with our formula knowledge. You'll see that the table we selected has these dollar signs built in, right? Shows $A, $1, right? Our very first cell to $H, $501. So it's going all the way down here, but that's locked in place. So it didn't add down to row 502 just because I did, right? So I could either select with my mouse, or in this case, since I just know what the cell is, I'm going to change this from 501 to 502. I'm going to hit OK. And then you saw my pivot table update, right? So that now it's 495 instead of 494, it's grabbing that extra row. So the moral of the story is with pivot tables, it's easiest to get your source data all together before you kind of get to the pivot table step. Otherwise, you have to do this little back and forth. But it's good to know you should not assume that it's happening automatically because it does not. That can cause annoying errors. Okay. Great. Any questions about that? Right. Okay, so we're gonna play around with that a little bit. So on your shows tab, I want you to use find and replace to change one of the category names. Okay, so for example, we could change technology to tech. You could change it to something silly instead if you like. But I want you to go to your shows tab and use find and replace, which if you don't know, find and replace, you can do edit find, or you can do Command F on your keyboard. And it's gonna give you this little text. So I could say find where it says technology, find, okay. So it's gonna find where that is in my document. It'll keep finding them all. I can choose to replace that with something. Maybe I don't want it to say technology. Maybe I want it to say tech, or maybe I want it to say marshmallows. I don't know. Up to you guys. All right. If I replace, it'll replace that word anytime it finds the word technology with marshmallows. You can see it'll do it right here. Great. It did it. It'll drop me down to the next one. I'm going to hit replace all. All right, great. So it went and found technology 47 times and replaced it with marshmallows. Okay. So once I make a change like that, I can go back to my pivot table. And my pivot table still has technology because I did not hit what button? Refresh. Very good. Okay, so to hit my refresh, I go back into my ribbon, back up to my pivot table, and I'm going to hit refresh. Okay, great. So now my table is updated. Boom. All right. Now, just for the purpose of demonstration, I'm going to go back to our table we made at the beginning of class. Oh no. This table, which was working perfectly fine before, is now showing an error because this formula is saying, go take the average if any shows have the category technology. And we just made that change, right, in our source data. And so there's no shows that have the category of technology anymore. So this is giving me an error. So this is just sort of another little demonstration of why pivot tables are great, because they're going to pick up on those changes if you hit that refresh button. If you made that change and we're just relying on this table, you'd have to come back and change it here as well. As your sheet gets more complicated, you can imagine you'd have to change data in multiple places to make an update, right? All right. So go ahead and do a find and replace, change a category, refresh your pivot table just to get a practice run of that. You should also try adding a row to your data set. Just add like a fake podcast name, and make sure you can successfully change your data source, which you can do in your pivot table ribbon to pick up that extra row. Okay. Yeah, questions? Yeah, what you got?
Try to add a fancy console.
Oh, weird. Did you already change the data source on your pivot table? All right, so let's go to your pivot table. You click on it. Let's just do change source. Change source. Let's make sure.
Like the size
Oh, yeah, the chart might be getting weird if it's trying to. So maybe try doing that as a. 502 and we see if that. Average.
那我要加一列这个印分，
经常在的事情，
加一列这个，
就一模一样。
就是直接加一列有印在这儿。
Yeah, you got, yeah, give that a try, see if that cleans up your chart. Yeah, question. Yeah, the refresh button is just right here in your pivot table. Perfect. Other questions, errors, questions with your pivot tables? Yeah. Yes, you can go in your here and you can just uncheck. Okay, got a good question about removing anything blank from your pivot table. So if anyone wants to do that, you've got here, I've got my blank row showing up. I can always go in because it's got this little built-in filter and sort. I can come in and just filter out that blank. So I'm hitting my little arrow next to category and I'm gonna uncheck my blank and hit apply and it'll just filter out. Cleans up my view a little bit. Now, if I were really working on this data, I might wonder why some of my podcasts have a blank category and I might want to go fill that in versus removing it from the summary. But yeah, in this case, it makes sense to remove. Yeah, question.
Yeah, so for now, this is like the sum of the monthly downloads. And if I want to add a column for the average of monthly download, should I just like how to like insert another column for this table?
I see what you're saying. Like it's showing, you want to show the sum and the average.
Yeah.
I don't remember if there's a nifty way to do that or not. So let's try it. Okay, so the question is, if we have our category and our monthly downloads, so maybe we've got the sum and we also want to show our average. Way to do it like a shift. Yes, okay. So if you hold down shift on your keyboard while you grab monthly downloads and then you drag it down a second time, you can grab that column again. And so then you can see right here, they're just both called sum. So I could come in my second one and change that to average. Yeah, so just hold down shift if you want to have that same column. Good question.
If we want to know the number of shows, is there any way we can do that in this pivot table?
Yep, absolutely. Anyone know how we could get the number of shows in this pivot table? Any ideas how we might do that? Number might be our count. So I would just do a count of something that I know, a piece of data that's filled in for every show. So in this case, I know every show has an ID and a title. So I would probably just throw in count of title or count of ID. That should give me the same.
That's smart.
Now I could, if every show has a monthly downloads number, I could, this would be kind of a silly way to do it, but I could do a count of monthly downloads, which is confusing, but it's basically just saying a count of every show that has monthly downloads filled in. I can actually see, right, some of my shows, these numbers are a little different. Some of these columns aren't filled in, so that's actually not a great choice. But yeah, any column where every value is filled in, I can use as my count. So it's usually good to go with like ID or something like that. So we got to average. Good, okay. Other questions, issues with the table pivot chart?
I'm so sorry, like, is it like comment C and comment B for the, if we want to,
copy
or
and
how to
paste.
drag?
Oh, how to drag, I think
Yeah.
if you go from your top, if you just hold down shift and then drag monthly downloads down
Oh,
again.
Oh,
Yeah, so hold down
thank you.
shift, then drag it from your fields down.
Oh.
Yeah. That'll give you a copy. So that, again, that's, you would do that if you want to do two different calculations on the same value. So here we want the sum and the average. Those are both coming from our monthly downloads column. So I would just hold down shift on my keyboard before I drag it again. I can even add a third one if I really want to, you know, go nuts. Add this, and I could add, you know, some other calculation. Say do the maximum of each. That's what I could do, and then for each category, it would take the maximum.
And I'll tell you.
Mm.
All right. Other questions?
Very clear.
All right, cool. Good question. That was, I didn't totally remember that, so that was a good refresher for me too. All right. All right, so just a last little aside on kind of, okay, so once you've made your pivot table, you've made your chart, then we're sort of starting to get into how do we want to present our data? What kind of story do we want to tell with our data? This is the sort of the moment in your data analysis process where you're sort of switching over from crunching the numbers to deciding kind of how you want to frame the results that you've got, right? So you might want to make, based on this same data set that we've been looking at, there's different points you might want to make about it or different reasons why you might be analyzing the data, right? You might be trying to convince someone that the top, you know, top shows that we work with are tech and business type podcasts. And because of that, we should invest in more advertising deals for those type of shows, right? That's maybe something. Or you might want to demonstrate we have podcasts across all these different categories. And that's something I want to highlight for some other reason to show the breadth of content that we have. So, you know, when we're kind of just like playing around with data, it's kind of like that, click around, make a pie chart, make a line chart, whatever. But we'll talk a little bit more next week about this, but this is sort of a step where you can think about what kind of point do I want to make to my audience with that chart. So this shifts a little bit from sort of the like technical how to get Excel to work over to what do you want to use it for, right? What point do you want to make? Okay. Any thoughts on sort of different types of charts you might want to use to make those different points?
Explain about the waterfall.
Yes, the waterfall chart, let's see if it's in this edition. Let's see, where'd my chart go? I got rid of my chart, okay, insert chart, all right, great. Okay, let's see if I got waterfall in this version. Okay, yeah, so it's gonna, so the kind of our chart options are gonna fall into a few different categories. these top ones are probably the most common ones that you see. Area gets a little funky. This is gonna kind of like combine values over time. I don't find that I use this one as much. I also don't use scatter plot as much. And then these ones are like more specialty use. This one in general is gonna be used if you have values that are fluctuating between negative and positive values. That's like the main use case for these. So you could imagine, I don't know, maybe like kind of like temperature data over time or across regions, something like that. I really don't use the charts in this like section very often. There are certainly like special, like these box and whisker plots. I don't know if anyone else did those in like the 5th grade math. Like, you know, there's stuff like these where they're just like only used for certain use cases, maybe certain kind of statistical analysis, stuff like that. I don't really use a lot of these, although you can. In general, what I would recommend for data visualization is trying to pick sort of the simplest thing that your audience will understand. If you're doing sort of a more complicated or less common chart where it's not needed, in general, it's gonna be kind of like hard to communicate your point. So I don't know. I personally have never used a waterfall chart in like a real life use case. So maybe if you're a meteorologist or something, you would, but I do not. Okay. Yeah, so just something to think about. I think like for me, if I were thinking about this, I would say, you know, if I'm trying to show all the different categories that we have, I would maybe choose like a pie or a donut chart so that I kind of have everything in like one visual setting. If I'm trying to show our top categories, I might instead do like a column or bar chart and maybe even highlight those 2 bars in a different color, right? I can do some kind of manual adjustment of my chart to kind of make my point. So for example, here, oh, this is like a little messy because I have all these columns. All right. I normally wouldn't have like sums and averages on the same axis, but for the purposes of not reformatting my whole thing, I'm going to do that now. So you can double click on any of your chart elements to do formatting. So if I wanted to double click on this, I'll get some formatting options that'll pop up. All right, you'll see I can choose my color, whatever. So if I want to change this one to yellow, I could change this whole series. If I don't have these broken down by series, you can just change individual bars as well. So that's the type of formatting that you just want to think about as we get into chart building. Okay. All right, that's all I had for today. Happy to hang around and answer other questions about pivot tables. What we're gonna do next time is kind of put everything that we've learned together into a dashboard kind of project. So we're gonna use some of our formulas, we're gonna use tables, we're gonna use charts like we just talked about, to kind of take a bunch of different data, and to someone over here asked a question about combining all our charts into one view, making it into a nice dashboard view for somebody to look at. That is what we'll be doing next week. I also wanted to talk a little bit about the series we're going to do later in the semester. I will be here teaching a Intro to SQL and Python class, I think in the same time block, starting a week or 2 after this session. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about that. I don't know if anyone here is interested in those sessions or not. SQL is going to be, it is a programming language, but it is a very simple data-oriented programming language. And it's very similar to the functionality that we've just learned in Excel. Okay, so all this kind of like manipulation of grouping my data together, taking averages, joining data together like we did with VLOOKUP and XLOOKUP, that kind of thing. SQL is basically a like more powerful than Excel tool to do that. I would say it is very similar to Excel in that knowing just a little bit is an extremely powerful tool that will get you very far. Python is useful too. We'll give you some tools there, but particularly with SQL, I would highly encourage anyone who's here, if you understood the kind of like Excel topics we've talked about so far in this class, you are in a good, even if you've never done any coding before, you are in a great position to understand what we'll be doing in SQL. Some of the projects and stuff we'll be doing will be almost exactly kind of similar to this, but you'll be learning how to do it with a coding tool, which is a lot more flexible. It can be used in a lot more environments. I work at a startup. A lot of startups or companies in the tech space sort of expect employees to know at least like very simple type of SQL, just to kind of like access company data. So that's a great skill. So I would just encourage you, if you're looking at SQL and Python and thinking like, I'm not going to go into coding, that's not really my thing. I would encourage you to come check out at least the first session or two of that series, which will be later this semester. If you like this, if you found this kind of stuff useful, SQL will be very similar.
So it won't be like really crazy coding?
No, it's very beginner. If you've never done any coding before, that'll be totally fine. If you have done some coding before, also have it sort of so you can like build on what you know. So I'll try to be kind of like open to multiple levels. But yeah, if you've never done any of it or just dabbled in it, you're totally welcome. Yeah. Okay, so I just wanted to put that little plug out there. I know it can be like, we don't like know what those letters mean, or we haven't heard that around as much as you hear Excel, but it is a very similar skill set and very powerful. So I hope that some of you will think about joining for that session. Okay, yeah, we got through that a little faster than I was expecting. So we are good. You may have 20 minutes back of your evening. But if you have questions about pivot tables, I will be here. I will hang out for a few more minutes and happy to chat. Cool. Yeah.
We addressed this in class before, but for this class, how do we get the certification after we've done? Do you have like a test or?
Oh, that's a good question. So this class isn't geared around a specific certification. There are certificates that you can pursue in Excel. I don't know. I know that the Digital Lounge sponsors some like, I think it's like Adobe certifications and stuff. This is not sort of that same thing, but you can go out and do those. So there's one that's through Microsoft. You can also, there's like a LinkedIn Learning like Excel thing that you can do. There's kind of a few different ways. I would say in general, Excel certifications are not super common from what I've seen as sort of a hiring manager or like my own job applications. It's not typically the type of thing that people expect you to be certified in. But like it's, yeah, a bit more of a practical skill. Now, if you want to like get the certification and do it, I think that's great. Yeah, I think maybe the most common one I've seen is there's a LinkedIn Learning thing. Yeah. Yeah, good question. Okay, yeah. Official time dismissed, but I'm happy to hang out and chat if people have questions. Yeah.
What is in Excel?
Yeah, it kind of depends. I would say pivot tables are sort of like your final product. So I would usually use formulas. Great question. I would use formulas sort of at more like the intermediate stages. So let's say I had my source data and I wanted to add a bunch of columns. I wanted to do a bunch of manipulation to my text, something like that. I would do all of that, all the formula steps kind of in my source data. And then when I was ready to do my final, like summarize it down, that's probably what I should do.
To table the results to present.
Yeah, yeah, good question.